This year, I've decided I'm going to absolutely dominate Formula One Fantasy. I've crunched the numbers, I've rewatched the races from last season, and I've planned ahead to find the best possible Formula One Fantasy team coming into the 2024 season. Let's pick our 5 drivers, 2 constructors, and get as many points as possible in Bahrain. And I did a live stream on this a little bit earlier on in the week, which did really well, but I thought I'd just give you an update because now we've seen some free practice sessions before Bahrain. And first and foremost, Max Verstappen's still on the team. He is an absolute must-have. If you look at the points from last season, he has double the average points per race than anyone else last year. And £30 million, even though, he's the most expensive driver by a considerable margin, is actually quite cheap. To get the same amount of points per race, you would have needed to have Sergio Perez and Lewis Hamilton across last season, which would have cost you way more than 30 million and will still cost you way more than 30 million this year. So there isn't really too much to say here. You need to have Max Verstappen in your team. Okay, if Red Bull absolutely fall off a cliff in Bahrain, you can swap him over next week, but you need him in for the first race of the season. Then I've gone for Charles Leclerc, and I think Charles Leclerc's the first pick for me where is maybe a little bit contentious. I know you could go for Lewis Hamilton. You could maybe go for Fernando Alonso as a little bit of a cheaper option. And I think if you pick Charles Leclerc at this point, it's a good person to have that you can pivot off of. I do think Ferrari were the second best team last year over the course of their season. I know Mercedes ended up finishing second in the constructor standings, but for me, Ferrari just felt like the closest competitor to Red Bull more often than the rest of the teams. It is a big gamble in terms of reliability. I know that Ferrari don't often start the season with the best reliability of anybody out there, but they've had time under Frederick Vasseur now. They've had a couple of years of these regulations, and I'm hoping they've kind of got to the bottom of some of their reliability issues, particularly with that Ferrari power unit. But for me, Ferrari just always are quite good in Bahrain. You look over the last couple of seasons, obviously Charles Leclerc won Bahrain in 2022, and then coming into 2023, he should have been on the podium last year, and probably should have been on the podium in Saudi Arabia as well. Because of the Ferrari's reliability, it was Fernando Alonso that was able to take those. So again, do you gamble on Fernando Alonso being able to replicate that? I just don't think that Mercedes and Ferrari are in such a bad position coming into this year like they were last year for an Aston Martin or a McLaren to be able to jump up onto the podium this year in Bahrain. And I just feel like, compared to Lando Norris, who's 23 million in the game, Charles Leclerc, if anything, at 19.1 million, is maybe a little bit underpriced, because what you're getting with Charles Leclerc is the possibility of a pole position every single Grand Prix. He is always the quickest in qualifying if he is given a package where he can deliver with that Ferrari car. And therefore, I can see the price of Charles Leclerc increasing over the season. And that's really what you want early on in the year. You want to pick up drivers that you think their price is going to increase, so you've got that ability to move around. And at this price point, if Charles Leclerc is starting to look, a little bit like he's not quite with it this year, or if the Ferrari car isn't as quick as we're expecting at this price point, you can pivot to a Lewis Hamilton, to a Lando Norris, maybe, if Charles Leclerc's price does increase that much over the first half of the season. Obviously, there's Oscar Piastri you could pivot to instead in the McLaren car if he starts to put together some racing performances that really start to catch the eye. Or, as I say, Fernando Alonso, if Aston Martin really do turn up, Fernando Alonso is so cheap in comparison to the other drivers at the top end of the grid, you can easily swap Charles Leclerc for Fernando Alonso, and that actually opens you up to a few more million that you can spend a little bit lower down. Third, I've gone for Pierre Gasly. For me, he has to be locked in. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say the Alpine car looks absolutely nowhere near as good as it did last year. And even though they finished in 6th place in the Constructors and they were nowhere near anybody else, maybe you shouldn't be looking at the Alpine cars this year. But first and foremost, Pierre Gasly was the highest points per race finisher of all the drivers outside of the top 5 teams last year, and it was by a considerable margin. And I think, you don't really think of Pierre Gasly as putting in those insane performances last season, but the second half of last year, actually, he really came to life in that Alpine car. And if he can continue to be that number 1 driver at Alpine, I feel like they are going to steer towards Pierre Gasly a little bit more. And if not, Esteban Ocon, if he comes back into it, maybe you can just swap out Pierre Gasly for Esteban Ocon, and it's fairly easy Alpine for Alpine trade. If you are worried about the Alpine car, and maybe the Alpine is a little bit slower than the RB, I can't see it being slower than the Williams, the Sauber, or the Haas, though. But if it is, then you can always swap out Pierre Gasly for any of those drivers that take your pick. I feel like Valtteri Bottas is quite a good one in and amongst that Sauber, Williams, Haas area, because I've already picked Alex Albon. Like, Alex Albon would be the obvious choice to swap Pierre Gasly with, but I think you have to have Alex Albon in your team already. So he's my fourth choice of driver. As I say, even though Pierre Gasly got the most points of any driver outside of the top 5 teams last year, I think the best performing driver towards the back of the pack last year, not in terms of fantasy points, but in terms of on-track performance, was this man here, Alex Albon. He was just able to outperform that Williams car so often, and I think he will continue to do that this year. And I think, you know, if the Williams car isn't quite as good as it was last year, at least you've got Bahrain, where it should suit the Williams car. We know the Williams car is quite peaky, but Bahrain is a power-heavy circuit, so it should suit the Bahrain track. And then in a few races' time, if we start to see that the Williams once again is a flip of a coin as to whether it's good on one track or bad on another, you can swap Alex Albon out. You know, you can bring him in for Monza, you can bring him in for Saudi Arabia, where there are really high-speed, straight-line parts of the track, and then you can swap him out for, you know, your Mexicos or your Monacos, where it is a little bit more technical and tricky for the drivers, and it doesn't really suit the Williams car that we have. And in that case, if you're looking at the Sauber, I feel like the Sauber is going to be the closest team to the Williams this year. You're probably looking at Williams being able to rotate Alex Albon, Valtteri Bottas. That's kind of where I'm looking at for that rotation. I want to steer clear of the Hasses, Kevin Magnussen, Nico Hülkenberg. As much as Nico Hülkenberg's great in qualifying, you're just going to lose all of those points in the race when he inevitably drops to 19th or 20th place, because the Haas car, in terms of its race pace, is just absolutely nowhere. But for now, in terms of the start of the season, you have to start with Alex Albon for me. Again, another driver whose price I think will increase. And finally, I have to admit, Daniel Ricciardo might be the better option for RB over the course of the entire season. But when you're picking your fantasy team, particularly now that we've had the free practice sessions, I think you have to start with Yuki Tsunoda. Yuki Tsunoda usually starts the year in incredible form. You look at 2022, 2023, he started both of those seasons really, really quick. In particular, last year, for the first 6, 7, 8 races, you know, he was finishing 10th or 11th place in an AlphaTauri car that really wasn't as competitive as this RB car looks like it's going to be. The RB car looks like it's going to be much better than the AlphaTauri that it disposed of last year. And it feels like Yuki Tsunoda, at least for the first 5 races, will be comparable to Daniel Ricciardo. And then you've got that option to swap Daniel Ricciardo in, right? So I feel like Yuki Tsunoda's price will probably increase, maybe a little bit more than Daniel Ricciardo's price will increase, just because I think Yuki Tsunoda will have the edge over the first few races this season. Then once Daniel Ricciardo really gets into the rhythm of things, you can swap out Yuki Tsunoda for Daniel Ricciardo, or even put both of the RB drivers in your lineup. I do think the RB drivers, with their price point where they are, Daniel Ricciardo 9 million, Yuki Tsunoda 8 million, there's a lot of expansion there for both of those drivers to increase in price, but also to get quite a lot of value in terms of the average points per race from both of those cars, because they do look like they might be able to fill that slot that Alpine are leaving. But we'll talk about that a little bit more, because I do think we need to talk about the constructors. Red Bull seems like the most obvious option, should probably be a lock-in, especially because Sergio Perez does usually start the season quite well. You know, you look at last year, it took until sort of 7, 8 races into the season where Sergio Perez started to drop off. He even won a couple of races at the beginning of last season. So Sergio Perez usually starts quite well. But I feel like because it's the last season we're going to see Sergio Perez in a Red Bull, I think that's basically guaranteed. And because the Red Bull car is a little bit more pricey, I've edged towards picking up the Ferrari. Because again, I think the Ferrari will be the second quickest car come race day. All of the speculation was sort of talking about whether or not McLaren could be there, whether or not Mercedes could be there. But I just think Ferrari, over the course of an entire weekend, are going to be able to do it. And Mercedes might be a little bit up and down to begin with. McLaren don't quite seem like where they were at the end of 2023. But mainly, when I'm looking at Ferrari, I'm just looking at the fact that they've got the strongest driver lineup, in my opinion. I've already picked Charles Leclerc, and Carlos Sainz was very close to going into my squad as well. I think he is a very, very good driver, and you're basically guaranteed Q3 appearances and guaranteed top 6, 7 finishes from both of these Ferrari drivers when they can hook up the car, because they are just, as I said, the best driver lineup on the grid. That is my opinion. I think with Leclerc and Sainz, you've got a little bit of everything. Both of them offer that ability to just rip out a performance that you're not expecting. And I've discussed Charles Leclerc before. Carlos Sainz, I think if you wanted to put Carlos Sainz into your team instead of Charles Leclerc, I think early on in the season, that makes perfect sense. The car is going to move more towards Charles Leclerc. We saw at the end of last year even that Charles Leclerc started to click with that Ferrari a little bit more. And I feel like that's only going to be the case because Carlos Sainz is leaving towards the end of the year. They are going to pivot this car towards Charles Leclerc. And therefore, if you're going to pick Carlos Sainz, pick him early, maybe swap him out towards the end of the season. Although he's probably quite a good pick early because he has that ability to put in those performances, and he does need to prove that he's going to get a drive somewhere else. He needs to kind of catch the eye for just long enough to guarantee himself a contract for the 2025 season. And then finally, my final pick is RB. The reason I said you could probably go Daniel Ricciardo, Yuki Tsunoda, and RB in your lineup if you wanted to, is because they do look like the team that is going to increase in price the most, because as I alluded to when I was talking about Yuki Tsunoda, it looks like Alpine are going to kind of drop from that 6th place in the constructor standings and be in and amongst that kind of back of the pack fight, and it looks like RB are the most likely team to be able to kind of escape that and finish in 6th place by a considerable margin. And it looks like Alpine will probably be in there with Williams for kind of 7th and 8th place, Sauber and Haas kind of 9th and 10th. And you want to pick up as many of those points because you've got to spend the money on Max Verstappen. You kind of need to look at who's going to finish 5th and 6th and pick up as many points as possible there, because RB are going to be that team where, you know, if a Ferrari DNFs, if a McLaren DNFs, if a Mercedes DNFs, it's going to be Daniel Ricciardo or Yuki Tsunoda that kind of fills in those point scoring positions, in my opinion. And they're just a completely different prospect coming into this season compared to last. So I think you could probably get away with having both RB drivers and the RB car in there as well. I've gone for Yuki Tsunoda over Daniel Ricciardo just at the beginning of the season. I can see myself adding Daniel Ricciardo to the roster a little bit later on. And a similar argument to Ferrari, really, just to summarize. I think, again, if you look at the kind of caliber of driver outside of those top 5 teams, Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon is a very good driver lineup, and you could say it's probably comparable to Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo. But if Daniel Ricciardo really starts to fire, I do think RB have the better driver lineup. Gasly and Ocon's kind of close. And then you look at those other 3, Kevin Magnussen, Hülkenberg, not really. Valtteri Bottas, Joe, not really. And then Williams have Albon, who's absolutely sensational. But Logan Sargent, for me, just I don't think he's going to put in the performances, especially early this season. There's a lot of pressure on him to deliver. And I feel like he needs that little bit of time to settle in, does Logan Sargent. So I'm going to go with RB. And I just feel like this as a lineup is probably the strongest you can have going into Bahrain specifically, whilst also allowing you the option to pivot. I think Max Verstappen is an absolute guarantee. You've got Charles Leclerc in there. If the Ferrari isn't quite as good as we're expecting, that's a pivot for me for maybe Lewis Hamilton in the Mercedes, or Oscar Piastri in the McLaren, or even Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin. You've got that ability to go either way with the Charles Leclerc pick. Pierre Gasly can easily be swapped for Esteban Ocon if Ocon is the faster Alpine driver, or if Sauber suddenly come out of the woodwork and phenomenal, maybe you swap Pierre Gasly for a Valtteri Bottas. I feel like Albon is the swap for Bottas though. Williams will have that car again where it's, you know, very up and very down. On those very down weekends, you swap out Albon, you maybe bring in a Sauber, maybe even bring in a Haas if they start to click in some way or another. And then Yuki Tsunoda is kind of that coin. You flip that for the other RB in Daniel Ricciardo if you manage to save a bit of money elsewhere, or you just keep Yuki Tsunoda in there for the beginning of the season until Daniel Ricciardo starts to really click. And then maybe you think about that full swap of Yuki Tsunoda to Daniel Ricciardo full time. And that's kind of your lock-in Daniel Ricciardo at that point. Ferrari and RB for me are just the 2 teams that offer the most value in terms of best driver lineup, consistency in driver lineups in both the top half of the grid and the bottom half of the grid. But I'd love to know your thoughts. Let me know what you think of this team. And as always, in the comments down below, get involved. This is a discussion. Quick video from me, no real big edits. I am going to be live for qualifying in a couple of hours time. So if you are around the channel then and you want to watch qualifying with us, please feel free to do so. Subscribe if you're new, leave a like. I've waffled on. Thanks so much. I'll see you soon.